Hello, everyone, and welcome to part one of a three-part Egypt series. These aren't super long lectures, except maybe for the last one, just because there's more to talk about there with the later part of the Egyptian history. Things get kind of exciting in there. But what we're looking at here is just the early development of human culture in Egypt. That's what we want to look at with this very first part one view of Egypt. This is a great image that shows you not only the Nile River, but also shows you how high the banks of the Nile River could get. And it's because the Nile River, like the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates that we talked about last week, when we talk about those rivers, the flooding annually of the Tigris and Euphrates, I mentioned also that there were 5 rivers in the world that did this, and it's along these 5 rivers where the earliest human civilizations will come about, because that flooding and ebbing every year always led to water, agriculture, natural seedlings coming down out of the mountains with the rivers, and minerals that would be kind of floated onto the banks where natural grains and whatnot would grow that nomadic people could live on, and then start to learn how to do the same thing the river was doing by moving mud and clays and the seeds and planting them in other places with some irrigation. This is a good sign of how powerful this river gets, because you don't just get this giant dune here, this hill along a 1,000-mile river, unless you've got a river that deposits a lot of stuff here very often. And this river can get this high. It has a catastrophic flooding season every single year. In fact, if you decide to go back in time, if you Bill and Ted it, and you go back in time, or Doctor Who, right? Don't live down here, all right? This is nice and convenient for most of the year, but you will all die, all right? You got to live up here. You got to live up at the top, okay? All right.
At Khartoum, in the Sudan, the White and the Blue Nile merge to form the longest river in the world. And once a year, the river lets loose its fury like no other, delivering bounty or destruction along its entire path. Each summer, weeks of severe rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands swell the waters of the Nile enormously. Kilometer by kilometer, the flood advances northward, leaving only small islands poking above the water. Depending on the amount of rainfall, the water rises between 2 and 8 meters. The flood waters finally swallow the Nile Delta, turning much of it into a shallow lake. For some of the first settlers, the flooding Nile often meant disaster. If they built their house on low-lying land, they could lose everything. To survive, they had to learn to live with the flood and use it. The ancient Egyptians learned fast.
So geography, let's take a look at where the Nile is from space. And the Nile wouldn't look much different, honestly, as far as the kind of the green of the Nile River from a satellite 3,000, 5,000 years ago than it does today. It's the same sort of idea. At nighttime, the satellites pick up just all the lights, because this is a hugely developed region. All the lights here, because people still live here in their millions today, whereas out here it's still just pitch black. It's still just dark at night. It's really cool. Just if you ever Google this, just Google the Earth at night and then kind of scroll around until you get to Egypt, and it's crazy to look at the Nile. It's like a giant LED light. Anyway, the Nile, you'll notice this long river, about 1,000 miles long. The Nile River is surrounded by water up here in the Med Sea and desert on either side. And so what that means is that once peoples settled along the Nile, they were kind of left alone by other peoples for a very long time. It took a while for folks to get here as they nomadically traveled around, which is why Mesopotamia gets settled before Egypt. Egypt's like the second big cultural settlement of this region. So right here, we're going to talk about this in a second with the notes, But this part of the Nile is going to be settled by people coming from way up this way, kind of this, we call it part of Eurasia or Asia. People coming down this way that kind of skirt around Mesopotamia and come right in here and start to settle down. Then up here, we have, and I say up here, and I'll explain that in a minute, we have people coming from Africa, from the internal part of Africa. We call it mostly Nubia today, that are going to settle along here eventually and just live permanently along these banks of the river, okay? Now, I'll explain what we call upper and lower and all that in just a second. But again, let's get with the main theme of the Nile River and why people settle there. Regular cycle of flood, plant, and harvest. It's predictable. People knew what to expect. That's why the Nile is going to be settled fairly quickly compared to other regions of the world, because it's a place that people can live in. It's fairly forgiving as long as you don't go too deep into the water during flood season, okay? Do not build your house along the bank of the lower Nile. It's not a good idea, all right? So it's very safe from an invasion for a long time. And the only fighting that really happens along the Nile are between the people that live along the Nile. There's very little fighting from people coming from the outside for a very long time, which allows these guys to kind of slowly develop and kind of create their own little happy universe. And then people do start to show up, and the Egyptians will have to deal with that. And it's kind of interesting to study that period, which we'll get to later. So the Nile itself is going to be worshipped as a god because it brings life to the people that live along it every year. So folks will naturally start to pray to it, right? Egypt, the gift of the Nile, if you've ever heard that phrase, it's just one that comes to us from a Greek historian, Herodotus. What I love about Herodotus is that he writes a lot about ancient history, and we people today in 2020 consider Herodotus an ancient Greek. So even the Greeks have people that they consider to be ancient, and I just think that's kind of fun to consider. Okay, so let's talk about geography, because you're going to hear about this a lot. There's this thing called the Lower Nile, and there's this other thing called the Upper Nile when we talk about Egyptian geography. Now, if it were me, and I had never heard about this stuff before, I would say that the Upper Nile obviously has to be here because it's in the north, and the Lower Nile obviously has to be here because it's in the south, and humans like to think about things fairly two-dimensionally. The reality is that this is not what names the Nile, upper and lower. So let's get to this. First of all, Lower Egypt versus Upper Egypt. Why do we call it that? Simple, elevation. It's literally just the altitude, okay? Mountains, where the Nile comes out of Ethiopia and down into Nubia, and then through into the ebbing downwards into the lower elevation of sea level right here at the Mediterranean Sea. So folks, when we talk about the Nile, we talk about the Lower Nile or Lower Egypt being down here, okay? Upper Egypt is right here, all right? It's upper because it is in a higher elevation. There's mountains there. That's the best way I can think of to put it, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now, this is going to settle earlier because peoples came out of this region of Western Asia earlier than people came up north from Central Africa when it came to finding and settling upon the Nile. And this region here is very politically and economically active very early because people were sailing along the coastlines from different places. So everybody from the Phoenicians to the ancient Celtic English way over here where England is, were able to sail along these coastlines and eventually make their way across this delta where you've got these people settling here very early, okay? So Lower Egypt becomes this metropolis, this kingdom, much earlier than Upper Egypt in the south does. And it does create its own kingdom here. These are not the same kingdoms. Different kingdom of Lower Egypt and kingdom of Upper Egypt, different people who don't really communicate with each other too much for a while until they do, and we'll get to that in a little bit, okay? What is interesting is that the people could trade along the Nile and still can, because the Nile, except for the flooding season every summer, the Nile is pretty calm with its current. It's pretty forgiving. So unlike a lot of rivers, it's possible to go downriver with the current, okay, and to sail upriver against the current, because there's a lot of current areas of the Nile that are pretty weak. So it's a very forgiving river where maritime trade could actually carry a lot of what you need. There's no need to build big roads in the desert in this part of Egypt, because you can just use the Nile. That's your super highway. This is the 405 right here. Okay, it's pretty cool. All right. So relative isolation, settlement along the Nile, different peoples, the Nubian Egyptians and the Asiatic Egyptians here. Let's get to that. Okay. So the Egyptians, the actual word comes from the idea of people of the black soil. And the banks of the Nile are very black. It is black, loamy, very mineral-rich soil. And we'll have a short video just about that in a moment. And that, and everything about this has to do with farming, all right? The people of the soil, all right? And it's because these people, of course, create a culture, a civilization based on managing that soil, that black, beautiful mineral wealth that comes out of that soil and allows the people of Egypt to farm it and, of course, to grow crops on it. It's a very important part of their life, okay, is this concept of living along that river. So, as I mentioned, Asian settlers were among the primary people to settle lower or northern Egypt, and Nubian settlers out of Africa are the ones that settle southern Egypt or along the upper Nile, where it's higher in elevation. I want you to notice something. Skin tone matters here. And this is an Asiatic group. This is the Nubian guys, okay? And they're all doing various things here. There's obviously some multicultural, multi-ethnic groups here because they're on the same page. All right, and you notice that some are much bigger and some are much smaller. It's because this is a Nubian view of Egypt, where the Asiatic Egyptians are all kind of smaller and the Nubian ones are much bigger. You know, that's kind of a Nubian tomb painting. And you'll see it's different with the pyramids, which show these Egyptians, right, which are the Asian Egyptians, different skin tone. I think it's just fascinating that they caught that and captured it in ancient Egyptian writings. I think it's fantastic. So by the time the Nubians come into contact with the Asian Egyptians, the lower Egyptians come into contact with the upper Egyptians. By the time that happens, lower Egypt or northern Egypt was far more developed because of its trade in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so population and technology meant that lower Egypt slash northern Egypt is always going to be, at least for now, a more powerful state. So we want to keep that in mind. And of course, there's a lot of natural protection here amongst this whole giant area. This whole region right here is about the size of New Mexico, right? It's a huge territory. So if anybody does try to invade, whether they're coming from the Nubian side, the upper kingdom, or they're coming from the ocean or something, the Egyptians are able to retreat into various fortress towns and defend their territory pretty effectively. Okay. Again, this is the delta. Delta is a territory where a river kind of spills into the ocean, and it always has this kind of fan right here, this kind of look of stuff just kind of spreading out as it goes into a larger body of water. So that's a river delta. All right. So again, this is all about the natural protection that the Egyptians had and other guys like the Mesopotamians did not have. Makes them a very unique culture. Mineral richness, guys. To live in ancient Egypt was a unique thing because it was much easier, I think, to live there than it was to live in a lot of other parts of the world, including Mesopotamia. If you look at Mesopotamian religion, it's all fairly harsh and caustic and somewhat cynical. You know, life is hard and how do we survive, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu and all this stuff. And then you get to the Egyptians and it's all kind of flowers and plants and happiness. and all the stories that came out in the 1900s about Egyptians and slavery and all that stuff, we don't have a lot of evidence of of slaves doing that much in Egyptian society. And the evidence that we do have for it shows that slaves were not treated that badly. It's an interesting culture that can get very violent during times of war, but the Egyptians just have so much that naturally comes to them. The amount of fighting that they have to do to survive is much less than other places have to do to survive with their own kingdoms and empires. So you've got mud to be used to create things that you need, like plates and jars, and your buildings are going to be made out of clay. You've got, of course, mountains all around you that are just coughing up gold and copper like crazy. You need those things to make a good culture and to have trade with. You've got fish all over the place to help them provide your protein. And of course, you've got cattle that you use to help farm, and those provide the food for you too, right? You've got reeds that allow the Egyptians to create the use of something called paper. They figure out how to actually build boats and baskets and paper out of reeds, okay? Everything they need is right there. It's right there. Now, Egyptians will trade this stuff to get things that they cannot get, like cedar wood from other parts of Europe and that sort of thing. But man, the Egyptians were allowed to live along this river by just the natural resources in relative peace overall for a long, long time. Nobody invading, really. You know, just it's an idyllic way to start a civilization. So again, if you go back in time, you want to pick any ancient sim to actually start up in, you want to probably go to Egypt. It's the best, I think, because of how supported by nature the people that lived there were. Okay. All right. Again, we call this the pre-dynastic period because this is super ancient, all right? This is when people are just starting to live there. But it starts with a bunch of different little settlements that turn into villages. Some of them turn into cities. And by the time we get to the 2000 BCE, way back then, right? We end up, well, sorry, about 3500 BCE. I'm wrong. About 3500 BCE, before Common Era, you've actually got counties that are ruled by a couple of kings. So there's a city-state, and it's in its own little county, and a city-state, and it's in its own little kind of territory or county, and right? And these are all called nomes, all right, nomes. So these nomes are basically an Egyptian version of a county, and there's about 20 of them here and about 22 of them up here, and basically the deal is that you've got a king, a Nubian Egyptian king up here ruling these southern counties, and you've got a Asiatic king in Memphis way over here ruling these northern counties. Okay, and so there's some interesting collusion that happens in the middle when it comes to fighting or peaceful trade between the Nubian Egyptians and the Asiatic Egyptians. Okay, so let's get to it. At some point, there is a melding of north and south of the northern and southern parts of Egypt into one kingdom. There is a mystery, as it says on the slide, because all we have about this is basically this thing, all right? And we have this idea that between 3200 BCE and 2780 BCE, which is several hundred years, okay, that between this period of time, some dude shows up to basically unite Egypt. The thing is that we don't really have any historical record for this. So it's just something that the Egyptians have said about their history because people told their generation, whose generation was told by their generation, who were told by their generation. We don't have any written stories really about this guy, a guy named Menes. Menes is credited with the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt. Again, we don't have any evidence for it. We have other people, all right, a Egyptian historian calling Menes Manetho, all right. Sorry, that is a guy named Manetho calling the king Menes, right? We have a Greek historian, Herodotus again, calling him Min, okay. We have King Lis of the 19th dynasty, much later, down in the historical rolls, calling him Mene. I'm going to tell you, again, I don't know if there's ever been a king named Menes. All we know is that the Egyptians back then believed that there was some guy named Menes. It could have been like a King Arthur or something, where you have this Well, how do we know where it all started? I don't know. Let's make it up. King Arthur. Okay. Well, the deal is, guys, is that we do have records for a king that does unite all of Egypt together a little bit later. I don't know if this is the first king to do it, or Menes did it first, and then Egypt kind of split apart again, and then this next king kind of figured it out for a longer term. I don't know. But historically, Menes is just a character that we have no evidence for. Okay? His name means he who endures, you know, the guy that survives and unites everything together, I guess, right? But again, all I can tell you is that Menes is given the credit for uniting Egypt together. The guy that actually does do it, at least that we have historical records for, is a fella named Narmer, all right? King Narmer. Narmer has a whole bunch of propaganda that supports him. And so he's got all kinds of bits and shards of pottery and tomb drawings and whatnot that gives a whole bunch of support for a guy named Narmer, who expands his part of Egypt to control much more, all right, the unification of Egypt. So a king named Narmer of the ancient period, all right? So he's going to unify Egypt, and what you're going to have then is Narmer is going to be Asiatic, and that means he is going to be from this part of Egypt, and this is the most politically and economically diverse and involved region of Egypt anyway. Not these guys up in the mountains from North Africa, but these guys here, all right, down in this part where the Mediterranean Sea is, where international trade has already happened. So obviously you're going to have the founding of a new dynasty, the early dynastic period, the Narmer dynasty of King Narmer, okay, this guy. And you have the capital of Memphis created, all right? So Memphis is now the capital of the first, at least historically understood and evidentiary kingdom of Egypt, all right? So he's the first king of the early dynastic period, which would be from 3150 to 2686. He didn't live that long. That's just the dynastic period, okay? So his what do you call them? His children and children's children will rule between 3150 and 2686. All right. Then after this period, a new dynasty takes over, and we call that period the Old Kingdom, because this is a kind of a different group of people who now rule the folks that live there. And Egypt has been around as a kingdom for long enough that it's able to have a large enough population that they can start doing things like developing advanced religious culture and building huge buildings like the pyramids, because there was plenty of labor to do so. Okay, so we'll start with the Old Kingdom when we get to the next lecture, the Old Kingdom going through the New Kingdom, all right? See you then.